Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 7th of March 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your hosts today, Ryan Gerrish and Mike Robinson. Well, Mike, The Sun.
Yes, we're starting with The Sun. The Sun has this headline: Miracle in the Rubble. Incredible moment. Baby is rescued alive after being buried by bombed building in Syria. They have a warning on it. Contains footage some people may find distressing. Well, it wouldn't surprise me if people find it distressing, because apparently these guys just digging at random find something, turns out, and they just drag it out of a hole, and then it gets a bit of a slap, and then they run off with it. There's no medical diagnosis, no doctors there, no serious. If this is really a baby, then
they would have harmed
the baby in the removal of this baby. But The Sun says this is a miracle in the rubble. Well, later on in the video, we come across this still, and let's just have a look. Now, I don't know, that could be a real baby. I don't know, but it looks very doll-like to me. I'm not saying it is a doll. I'm just asking the question. I'm saying to The Sun, at what point have you set aside your journalistic standards and not actually examined the video that you are putting on the front page of your website, not only to offer some critical analysis of how they are treating this child, if it is a child, as it was dragged out of the rubble, and the way that these white helmets are approaching their work, and if it is not a child, if in fact this is a plastic doll, which it looks like from that still, then why are you not asking about the veracity of this, whether it's propaganda or not? It is a disgrace. The British media has become a disgrace. And so I want to remind everybody once again of the Media on Trial event coming up in Leeds on the 27th of May. And the question that's being asked at that event is, has the UK mainstream media, is it in breach of the Terrorism Act in this country as a result of effectively shilling for terrorists in Syria and other parts of the Middle East, and in fact embedding themselves with terrorists when they do go to the Middle East to report? So I would suggest as many people as possible get along to that, because this is a serious question that needs to be answered.
Serious questions, and of course we see the British government attempting to close down in ever more draconian ways on other media sources. So either we stand up for those sources or we're going to lose them. Absolutely.
Now, last week, as we reported, Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, was giving a statement to the House of Commons on his consultation on the Leveson inquiry and whether they should proceed with part 2 of the Leveson inquiry. And during his speech, he said, Sir Brian Leveson, who I thank for his service, agrees that part 2 of the inquiry should not proceed on the current terms of reference, but believes that it should continue in an amended form. So that's what he said last week. Well, the usual suspects have been rolled out in response to this, because lots of people who were campaigning for the original Leveson inquiry seem to be a little bit sad that part 2 is not taking place. And it begins with the BBC, who produced this yesterday. And this article says that an ex-private investigator who was used by the Sunday Times has spoken about the criminal activity he was involved in to obtain information for the paper. This is a guy called John Ford. He says he targeted politicians such as Tony Blair and Gordon Brown when they were in government. He said his methods included what he described as blagging, pretending to be a bank or utilities account holder to get information. The Sunday Times has said that it strongly rejects any such claim, that it ever commissioned anyone to act illegally. And so this is part of the efforts to try to get Leveson 2 back on track. Who else was the BBC rolling out? Well, John Prescott, of course, the former Deputy Prime Minister, who is a long-time campaigner as part of the Hacked Off campaign and so on. And also Tom Watson has been speaking out about this on the Labour Party website and across the mainstream media. These new blagging revelations show Leveson Part 2 must go ahead. Now, if you want to remind yourselves what the background to Leveson was all about, Have a look on the UK Column website for our article there, Leveson Inquiry, Control of the Press and Media by David Bell's Common Purpose. This was the article and the research which eventually ended up as 13 pages in the Daily Mail, which effectively blew the Leveson Inquiry out the water, Brian. But that gives good background to this. And in the meantime, as we know, YouTube has been purging what it considers to be channels which exhibit content that they don't particularly like. And verdict here saying these are the biggest channels removed as part of YouTube's purge. It's not just the likes of Richie Allen and so on, it's many, many others as well now. Well, across the mainstream media, we see stories sort of backing YouTube up on this. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 second that I or the UK Column should agree with what the so-called conspiracy theorists have been doing in this article, but this Guardian article saying conspiracy theorists arrested for alleged threats at site of Texas church shooting. Robert Ussery charged with making terroristic threats after allegedly threatening to hang the pastor whose daughter was killed. And this is part of a campaign by the Guardian suggesting that people who are asking questions about the recent so-called mass shootings in the United States, that they are now becoming an epidemic, conspiracy theorists harassing victims. Now, the fact of the matter is, Brian, that anybody harassing anybody, there's already law in place to deal with that. That should, if there's a criminal offence is being committed, then that should be dealt with. But what's happening here is that this is being used as an excuse. If there is criminal activity here, it's being used as an excuse for a much broader shutdown of free speech on the internet. And this, as we've said before, comes originally from David Cameron's speech to the UN General Assembly, where he, was suggesting that extremism is not just about Islamic extremism; it's also about people that are asking questions about 9/11 or other issues, 7/7 and so on. So he's broadened this topic right out. YouTube is now acting on it, following their visits to Number 10 and Theresa May, trying to get them to act on it, and they're being backed up on this by the mainstream newspapers.
It's quite blatant, Mike, that this is a reframing exercise on the wider public mind. I think it was the Sunday Times last Sunday just gone. I came across an article which was basically suggesting, if you read it through, what it was suggesting is that people that home educated their children were effectively on the semi-extremist list. So because some extremists had home educated their children, the thing was spun, it was turned on its head. If you home educate your children, well, society needs to look at you as if you are a potential terrorist. Well, where's all this policy coming from? It's coming out of the Conservative government. Let's just recap a little bit here. This is Theresa May as we prefer to call her. And we pointed out that she was going to take control of the so-called housing crisis because it wasn't going well enough. Theresa May stepping in. She hasn't sorted out the European Union or Brexit, but she's working on global trade personally, and she's going to take control of the housing crisis. We're saying you need to watch this lady very carefully. What is she really up to? Because what she was doing here was selling off public housing stocks. So this is what's going on. Well, let's compare that with this headline: Britain's health service not for sale in US trade talks. So the sub-headline there is Prime Minister Theresa May said on Monday that Britain's National Health Service was not for sale in any future trade deal with the United States after Brexit. Mike, why would she need to say that?
Because I think she intends to sell it off as part of these trade talks.
Well, listen to me, it's a hostage to fortune, isn't it? If you're not doing it, why do you need to deny it? Has somebody accused her of selling it off to the Americans? Well, let's have a look at what she said here. She said this: I'm absolutely clear that as we look to negotiate a trade deal with the United States of America, the National Health Service will remain as it is today. And for me, this is the key piece of text. The National Health Service will remain as it is today, because if we analyse the state of the NHS today, it's this really. So I've paraphrased a few words that, of course, she didn't say, but she's really saying, look, I'm happy to state off the record that the NHS is not for sale because it's already been sold off piecemeal.
Yeah.
And we have already agreed the final steps with our insurance industry partners. I mean, this is not something you'd find on eBay. So in the background, blatantly obvious that the Conservative Party's policy has been to sell off the NHS. And now, of course, that she's being caught out, she's got to make this much bigger denial. No, I'm not really selling it to the Americans. Well, just very quickly here, we'll recap on the evidence that we put forward a couple of weeks ago. So here we were talking about NHS new care models. If you don't know what this stuff is about, you need to know, because this is the codified sell-off of the NHS, integrating care, contracting for accountable models. Contracting, this is the contractual private arrangement. And of course, if you're dealing with private contracts, you're going to be dealing with profit and loss, and you need the accountancy angle. So you can have a look at that. The new business model, there's a bit of a clue in the name. And they say it's not privatisation, but simply big business. We say that's a complete lie. So have a look at these documents. I'll just put this up on screen very very quickly. Here we just decoded some of the amazing Newspeak sustainability and transformation partnerships, accountable care systems, accountable care organisations. They're going to have a contract with a single organisation for the great majority of health and care services and for population health. The moment you see the word contract, you know that this is privatisation of the NHS. MCPs, multi-speciality community providers and PACs. I think the language is deliberately difficult, Mike, so that people simply can't understand it. And of course, in the middle of this, we've got the King's Fund. If you don't know what this organisation is, you need to know, because they say that they're independent, they say they're a charity, but they are producing a lot of the political policy, which is simply changing the NHS from what we know into a privatised system. So have a look at the documentation. What is accountable care? They start to talk it through, what it actually means. And some people are pretty wise to it, because we found this gentleman on Facebook or Twitter, I think it was. He's saying that ACOs will be given the money for your care as an insurance premium and will pay out only for certain treatments, like an insurance company. So this gentleman was very, very accurate in his statements, and what he is warning about is that the NHS is very nearly completely privatised, hence Theresa May can't sell it. Now, today we had an interesting anonymous phone call. A member of the public called us to say, were we aware that the Princess Royal was visiting an A&E department at Leicester Royal Infirmary, which we weren't. And the caller said, well, I'm interested in giving you a bit of a heads up, because basically this new 48 million A&E facility is already greatly over capacity, to the extent that staff can't cope, patients are not getting the best service, but for the royal visit, surprise, surprise, everything's going to be tidied up. And we did contact NHS England media team. They have come back and asked another question, but we haven't got a response yet. But we were able to tell them that over the last year, the UK column has had a huge amount of concern about the NHS from members of the public and indeed professionals. And this latest allegation that there's big problems in this brand new A&E unit was just another piece of information that we felt we should follow up on. And a good timing here, because we'll bring in the fact that in the Albert Hall, Nottingham, on the 12th of May, the UK column because of this immense response from the public, is going to put on a conference to do with the NHS dying for good health. Some text on screen, which is giving you a rough outline of why we're doing this, so you can freeze that screen and read it. I know the text is small. That's the address for the Albert Hall. Will probably be a start at about 10 o'clock. Tickets will be on sale shortly at £20. UK column subscribers, £15. So the NHS, Mike, I think is going to become one of the biggest hot topics in this country. Are the Tories selling it off? Yes, they are. Can we stop it? Yes, I think we can, but we have to get the evidence out in front of the wider public.
Yeah.
I'm on the move north of the border on Saturday. This is for the launch of the Fresh Start Foundation, which of course is alerting the country to child abuse and in particular SRA. And I'd just like to say there's the venue, Eric Liddell Centre, 15 Morningside Road, Edinburgh. So if you're north of the border or north of England and can get to that event, a huge amount of work has been done by the volunteers to set up the Fresh Start Foundation, and they've done it because there is no confidence north of the border into the official Scottish government inquiry into child abuse.
And we should mention AV9 coming up the 4th to the 7th of May at the Horwood House Hotel near Milton Keynes. The hotel apparently has made some extra rooms available, so there are tickets available for this. You can get more information at alternativeview.co.uk. Right. Brian, we've shown this many times, UK outstanding debt. And one of the features on this was state pensions, which, although not a debt in the sense that money hasn't been borrowed in order to fund state pensions, it is an obligation that the country has to meet. And this figure, the 2015 total, is really because, particularly with regard to pensions, it's very hard to find out an up-to-date figure. Well, interestingly enough, the Office for National Statistics has published the 2015 figure today, and the picture is actually quite a bit worse. So at the end of 2015, they say total accrued to date gross pension liabilities of UK pension providers in respect to employment-related pensions and state pensions was estimated at £7.6 trillion, up from £6.6 trillion at the end of 2010, and that's not adjusted for inflation. So the graph has had to be adjusted to this. So we now have a state pension black hole of £5.2 trillion and a private sector pensions black hole of £1.6 trillion. Now the corporate debt figure of 1.6 trillion on there is an estimate because it's practically impossible to get accurate figures for this stuff, and actually many of the figures here are estimates with the exception of government debt and the pension debt, because it's so difficult to get figures for this. So this is probably an underestimate of the true picture still. But what we're looking at is a total outstanding debt situation for the UK of at least 844% of GDP. And that is simply unpayable, Brian. So this actually, to my mind, comes back to this issue of the NHS. It comes back to this issue of pressure on older people to consider how they might shuffle off this mortal coil. And the question is are these pensions payable? When the money has been stolen from the private sector and when the money isn't there in the public sector, how are these pensions payable? And as this population ages and our infrastructure creaks under the already high levels of immigration that we've got, we're still not bringing enough younger generations into the country to pay for the older generations. So what are the options here?
Well, I think the option that's going ahead is to actually remove older people. Perhaps some of the audience will be shocked to hear me say that, but I think the evidence for that is growing and growing. And when we've had, I think it was a Conservative lady Member of Parliament saying, well, it wasn't right that people should pass their houses and leave their possessions to their children. They should go back to the state to help fill this hole. We know we're dealing with some very, very low empathy politicians, to put it politely. But of course, let's remember that the whole of this debt bubble has been created on the lie of the international banking cartels creating money out of nothing and then loaning it out, particularly to governments as interest. I find it significant, Mike, that your graphic there is the only graphic that I think we have seen consistently, which gives that level of detail about the pension black holes and the real state of the economy. If Greece was to be declaring that it was 844% over GDP in debt, Greece, of course, would be completely laughed at by the whole of the EU banking fraternity. But this is the reality of UK. The country's bankrupt. The government doesn't want to talk about it. And certainly the government doesn't want to talk about solutions, which of course include the key thing of taking power away from the corrupt international banking cartel.
Absolutely. And speaking of them, RBS back in the news again today because US authorities yesterday landed them with another $500 million penalty for, quotes, deceptive practices. This follows mortgage irregularities that led up to the 2007-2008 crash. It also follows a £5.5 billion fine which the bank agreed in 2017 to pay the US regulators. As I say, this is about subprime mortgages and the fact that they were selling mortgages on the markets which were clearly not fit for purpose. RBS admits that it sold investors RBMS backed by mortgage loans that did not materially comply with underwriting guidelines, they said in a statement. They said many of the mortgage loans did not comply with applicable laws and regulations. Nobody, of course, has gone to prison for this. Nobody's being prosecuted. They're getting a couple of fines. This follows on last week from the continuing saga of GRG, the Global Restructuring Group, part of RBS, which ended up putting a whole swathe of small businesses out of business in the UK. Assets stripped them. And it turned out last week that out of 32 senior managers at GRG, now that it's been rebranded as the restructuring unit, it's no longer called the Global Restructuring Group, it's now the restructuring unit. 32 managers from that GRG group, only 2 of those had not previously worked at GRG, so they haven't got rid of any of the staff. It's the same staff, and 94% of senior managers, and of the other 182 employees, 75% of those came over from GRG. So it's the same staff, it's the same operation. I can't believe that it's not the same corruption, but well, we'll see.
Okay,
but
just pause.
Yes, I know.
I'll pause. It's a little bit too obvious.
Yes. Now, we got an interesting email yesterday from an anonymous person calling themselves a friend, asking us to take down an article, basically because they said that they were involved in some of the incidents that were described in the article. But it's very difficult to take down an article that when you don't know who you're speaking to or who's speaking to you.
And you can't ask questions.
You can't ask questions and so on. So this is the article that they wanted us to take down, and I just thought it was worth mentioning it because actually it's quite relevant to what's still going on today, particularly with, for example, the visit from the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to Britain today. We're not going to mention that in any more detail, but this article is entitled "Imposters, False Friends, Manipulators of the Counter-Jihad Movement." And it says, it's written by Tony Shells, fantastic article. It says, in July 2003, an article by American journalist and economist Robert Locke was published on the VDARE website. In that article, Mr. Locke called for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, for their forcible removal from both Israel and the occupied West Bank. Mr. Locke's suggestions of how that might be achieved included the destruction of Palestinian food and water supplies, the banning of all economic activity, summary arrest and deportation, the use of police and army to physically drag Palestinians away from their own homes, and the blowing up of those homes with the families still inside if necessary. After learning of Mr. Locke's article, the editor of the American Conservative magazine, Mr. Scott McConnell, sacked Robert Locke as a contributor of that magazine, saying, "I wrote him a letter telling him what that whatever our editorial boundaries were, this piece had transgressed them, and that I was no longer comfortable working with him as a writer, adding that he found Mr. Locke's views to have been expressed with a glee and specificity that it's in its glorification of power and violence that I frankly found rather creepy. The article goes on to say Robert Locke began appearing on the website of a US-based far-right Zionist pressure group, Think Israel, and that in late 2005, Robert Locke visited Britain. The visit included a private meeting with Nick Griffin, who was chairman at that time of the British National Party, at Mr. Griffin's home. Nick Griffin published an article that followed up with an article that detailed a future BNP political strategy. Much of the article concerned Mr. Griffin's rationale as to why criticism of US neoconservatism had to be taboo. So he did not want to see the BNP criticising neocons in the United States. The article then discusses the ideology which seems to be behind this intervention into the nationalist movement in the UK by Robert Locke, and that's coming from Chicago interests and so on. The article then says the only permitted position regarding any European and English counter-jihad movement is therefore that it must be pro-Zionist and pro-Israel. It may be that observations of UK groups involved in such campaigns, such as EDL, etc., will reveal evidence of this form of manipulative control. And the article concludes by saying, which brings us back to the Palestinians and ethnic cleansing, the threat of Islamic fascism and of jihad in England comes not from the Palestinians, but ultimately from Saudi Arabia. The source of funding for the building of mosques in the UK and the supply of radical preachers comes predominantly from Saudi Arabia and its Gulf state neighbours. The terrorist bombers come from Saudi Arabia, the Horn of Africa, Pakistan, and from Islamic areas of Britain. The irony is that this is a situation made possible by a geopolitical agenda pursued by a US-Israeli Saudi alliance, and most particularly within the political military elite of those countries, and enthusiastically assisted by the treasonous activities of successive British governments. I don't see too much wrong with this article. Now, of course, the email was commenting on the parts of this around Nick Griffin, I suppose, and we can't. This is based on pretty deep research. We weren't in the meetings themselves, but you know, the general thrust of this article absolutely seems to be
correct.
Absolutely
correct as to what we see unfolding around us. So we're intrigued. Perhaps our viewers and listeners might like to find that article and read it. Are we missing something? But it's fascinating that from 2011, this has suddenly surfaced. We can't ask questions of the original person who sent in the email because the email address is
it's anonymous, it's a fake email address.
It's a fake email address. So help us out with that. Could it be that that article is a little bit too accurate for comfort in some directions? Well, on matters policing, let's have a look at Mike Veal. Now, I'm going to thank a gentleman who sent me an email. He did identify himself, but he said what had happened to Mike Veal. I replied that UK Column had said that Mike Veal had gone on to become Chief Constable at Cleveland Police, but in going to have a little look to see how he was getting on, I was astonished to find that we'd missed this little spat. This is at the end of January, but here was Mike Veal's appointment, and my goodness, that had stirred up some controversy. So the headline here, teased Mayor, new Cleveland Police Chief Constable Mike Veal shouldn't be taking charge. So the mayor, particularly outspoken. Of course, the mayor is a Conservative. Well, one of the local MPs, also very outspoken, Simon Clarke, also a Conservative. Could I think, Mike, that they were getting a little bit sweaty at the thought that Mike Veal was a bit too close with knowing the truth about Ted Heath and the abuse of children? So let's have a look at what the mayor said. Mike Veal shouldn't be taking charge, and Barry Coppinger, that's the police commissioner who selected him, and Cleveland Police really need to seriously reconsider appointing him. I have absolutely no faith that our new Chief Constable will be able to provide the support that is required for our frontline police officers to fulfil their duty to protect the public. That's a remarkable statement, Mike, in view of the fact, not least, of the immense problems inside Cleveland Police with corruption and lies and bullying and a whole range of other things.
But aside from that, Mike Veal absolutely stood up for his officers that were investigating Ted Heath and that were the recipients of such disgraceful abuse while they were in Wiltshire Police.
Yeah.
So he stood up for his policemen. Any suggestion that he wouldn't do the same in Cleveland is nuts.
Well, I think he will do the same, and I think he's capable of doing the job. So we've got all the local Conservatives sweating that a man who's drilled into the very dark heart of the Conservative Party could cause them some problems. So these people are not interested about good policing to protect people in the area. All they're interested in is protecting the reputation of the Conservative Party. That has to be an oxymoron. So let's bring in that MP. Here he is, Simon Clarke. He said this: I have real concerns about the appointment of Mike Veal as our new Chief Constable and think the Police and Crime Commissioner and the appointments panel face serious questions. We all know Cleveland Police has a huge task on its hands to restore public confidence in its leadership. This news makes that task harder rather than easier. I will be raising all these questions with the new Chief Constable and the PCC, and I'm requesting a meeting. So there's another Tory who is lashing into Mike Veal, the man brave enough to stand up and do his job, and that including investigating former Conservative Prime Minister Ted Heath and child abuse. We had a little look at Mr. Clarke's web page, always a good thing to do, because we find articles here where he's very worried about policing. Simon Clarke MP meets Chancellor of the Exchequer regarding Cleveland Police, replies to the Police and Crime Commissioner Barry Coppinger. Simon Clarke pens open letter to Police Commissioner regarding police presence in East Cleveland. He's not happy they've got enough. And I loved this bit because on the top menu there, you can see it says news highlighted campaigns My Map. Well, I was fascinated, so I went to My Map, and surprise, surprise, Mike, the map is absolutely blank, which is probably ideal for Simon Clarke.
Yes.
There we go. So where does this lead us? Well, we learned more that actually Chief Constable Mike Veal is being accused of a crime at the moment. Can you imagine what sort of crime this man may have committed?
No.
That requires an investigation?
No.
A full one?
Okay.
Ongoing. It's this. It's a claim he deliberately damaged a police phone.
Oh.
Okay, so there's this constable who's put his whole career on the line to do what is right for children being abused, but he might have damaged a police phone. And this is being investigated. There was also a previous investigation that was dropped because, of course, it was complete nonsense. So the Gazette Live introduces that into the text. So this is a disgraceful police officer. He's damaged or possibly damaged a police phone. And who's carrying out the investigation? Well, it's our old friends, the Independent Office of Police Conduct, and we highlighted them because when they investigated the testimony of Met child abuse whistleblower John Wedger, they found that there was no evidence whatsoever to support his statement that when he talked about the abuse of children, he was bullied, harassed, and told to shut up. So they can investigate a phone, but they can't investigate Mr. Wedger. But this is what Michael Lockwood had to say about Mr. Veal. The IOPC has, however, decided to independently investigate a second part of the referral relating to allegations that a mobile phone belonging to Wiltshire Police was deliberately damaged by Chief Constable Mike Veal. This investigation is in its early stages. Is this man a muppet, Mike, or is he some form of silicon doll that's been imported from China? I don't know, but this is unbelievably dangerous stuff. Actually, he's probably come from Korea, a silicon doll from Korea.
I don't know. I don't know. This is it just gets sillier by the day. Well, speaking of Korea, this is the Korea Herald, because actually there's been some pretty amazing developments in Korea in the sense that the North and the South are speaking to each other. A South Korean delegation headed up to the North. They came back to Seoul yesterday. They had 2 days of talks while they were in North Korea, and they met senior leadership in North Korea, including Kim Jong-un. And as a result, they've agreed to hold a summit in April. They issued a statement which went as follows. The two Koreas agreed to convene a third inter-Korean summit at the Peace House in late April. To achieve this, the two parties agreed to hold working level consultations in order to ease military confrontation and foster further consultation. The two Koreas agreed to establish a hotline between the two countries. North Korea showed its resolve for denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The North also made clear that there's no reason for them to possess nuclear weapons as long as military threats to the North are eliminated and the regime's security is guaranteed. North Korea expressed its willingness to begin earnest negotiations with the US to discuss denuclearization issues and normalize North Korea-US relations. North Korea made it clear it will not resume strategic provocations such as additional nuclear tests or ballistic missile tests while the dialogue continues. And finally, in order to sustain a reconciliatory and cooperative mood following the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, North Korea invited a South Korean Taekwondo demonstration team and arts troupe to Pyongyang. So this is a major step forward. And they also said that Kim Jong-un was of the understanding that joint South Korea-US drills would be resumed on a scale similar to past years. And so he's probably not happy that that's going on, but he's certainly willing to accept it. So this is a piece of positive news, but apparently not, because for the warmongers at the BBC, it's not good news. Their take on this was North Korea used VX nerve agent to kill leader's brother, says US. Right, and the bit about the deal that's been done between the North and the South is 2/3 of the way down through this. So this is a minor story in terms of the overall geopolitical situation, but they put the important story 2/3 of the way down this page. CNN's no better. Trump teeters on the edge of a familiar North Korean trap. Well, what did Trump actually say? He said possible progress being made in talks with North Korea for the first time in many years. A serious effort being made by all parties concerned. The world is watching and waiting. Maybe a false hope, but the US is ready to go hard in either direction. So, he is seeing the positive picture with his usual, fist. But he tends to be a bit
black and white.
Yes, absolutely.
Things, yeah.
But the coverage in the mainstream press, just its usual deplorable self.
Yeah, absolutely, because at the moment we don't have any reliable mainstream media. I will remind people again, and I'm going to keep doing it, that of course it was a survey reported by the Daily Mail that 83% of people in Britain did not trust the BBC. 83%. Is that statistic about right? I think it's about right, because when I talk to people locally, we can be discussing other subjects. You just ask them what you think of the BBC, and often they start laughing. So well done, the BBC. Think you've got a way to go. Now, we'll end on this note. I've been hearing rumours about this, or have been hearing rumours about this for some time. It concerns the LGBT movement. And what we were informed is the next stage of the process was to introduce the letter U. I've labelled it here as unknown, but in fact it could be also unsure. But what we've got here is a charity backed by the National Health Service, which is now saying that very young children don't necessarily know whether they're little boys or little girls. So this charity is going to help them decide. And if anybody's feeling squeamish about talking about LGBT issues, we say there's no need to be squeamish at all. Because the ultimate agenda is transhumanism, where there will be no fully independent human beings. That's where it's going. The LGBT agenda is just a stepping stone. So let's have a look. Here's the All Sorts Youth Project. It's got a message from the founder, Jess. In 1999, with James Newton, I set up All Sorts Youth Project. In those early days, we had no funding, but a lot of enthusiasm. We got going in Brighton, basically. Our first grant was £1,000, our second 5,000, but the next one from the Diana Fund was for 220,000. So how remarkable. You start a little charity and the next minute you've been given £250,000 in order to do what? Well, read on through. One of the biggest changes in recent years has been the huge numbers of under 16s attending the project following the development of contracts with all of our local secondary schools. So this is a financial arrangement. We're into contracts. We're also developed innovative and unique support work for trans children and young people. So here was a link through to the kids group. I thought that was worth looking at. And if we go to the kids group is a fun and supportive monthly group for trans and gender questioning children of primary school age. 5-year-olds, Mike, who are apparently questioning their agenda. I'm going to highlight that and I'm going to put this question. What happens when you suggest to a 5-year-old they don't know if they're a little boy or a little girl?
Yes, this is the question, isn't it? Is the idea that they don't know coming from them, or is it being put in their heads?
Yeah, these suggestions being put in their heads. So I would say as a parent, I would find this immensely dangerous. But of course, one of the very dangerous things is that these organisations, without parents being fully aware across the country, are able to get the support of the National Health Service, and also they're getting into local schools because the Education Authority are giving them access. So the U is now so critical because we're hearing that where it is going is that basically little boys, little girls, no, it will be born and it will not know what it is until it decides it's going to say, I'm a boy or I'm a girl. So we'll have babies, but those babies won't have any sexual identity, according to these people, these sorts of people, until that child says at the age of 5 what it is. I think this is unbelievably dangerous, but as I say, if you're squeamish as a member of the LGBT community, then you should be researching transhumanism and the government's policy to move us on through the gay agenda to a world which is truly, truly horrific. We'll end there. Thanks very much for joining us. Don't forget those conferences, book your tickets, and for the weekend, if you can get north of the border to Edinburgh to join in the Fresh Start Foundation, I'll be delighted to see you there. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.